Penn State On Demand is a service of Penn State Public Broadcasting, and now you can support WPSU when you shop online. Visit WPSU.org/shop to make purchases from national online retailers, and WPSU will receive a portion of the sale with no extra cost to you. So start your online shopping at WPSU.org/shop.
I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
You don't ever say to her that
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Does
Great discussion on the ethical implications
more
of a community.
We're trying to back over.
currently doing in autism.
More and more information is available on children with autism, but what about adults on the spectrum? Scott Robertson is a Penn State doctoral candidate and an autistic self-advocate. He founded a support group for undergraduates with spectrum disorders and co-founded the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, an international organization dedicated to expanding societal acceptance and community understanding of autism. We'll talk with him about what it's like to be a college student with Asperger's syndrome, about why autism should be accommodated rather than eliminated, and about how his own research might someday help other autistic college students. Here's our conversation with Scott Robertson. Scott Robertson, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
The vast majority of diagnoses on the autism spectrum are made by a child's 8th birthday and ideally by a child's 2nd or 3rd birthday. You weren't diagnosed with autism until 1999. Tell us a little bit about the journey that led first to a self-diagnosis and later to a doctor's diagnosis of autism.
Yeah, when I was growing up, and I'm part of that generation that had been left out, where the disability wasn't understood as well when I was growing up. So when I had self-diagnosed in college in '99 after I read a book on autism, but growing up I had only been identified with what was called neurologically impaired, is the special education identification they used during my K-12 time. Which was just kind of a default label they gave in New Jersey. I grew up in northern Jersey so I could get services like occupational therapy, speech, language therapy, and learning support. And I grew up thinking that I just have learning disabilities, didn't necessarily know, thought that maybe it went beyond that because most people I knew with learning disabilities, I had different challenges than them, but I didn't really understand exactly where until what it meant until I had undergrad studies.
And in fact, the book that you read that kind of changed everything for you was a book by the title Mind Blindness by Simon Baron-Cohen. What was it about that book that for the first time helped you see yourself?
The book I just happened to read by happenstance in a class called Minds and Machines in undergrad studies. Just happened to be taking the class, just thought it was just sounded cool actually. I was a freshman back then, 19 years old. And I hadn't read much about autism before then. You'll find a lot of autistic people as adults say, especially if we didn't learn about being autistic until adulthood, didn't know necessarily much about the disability, ironically enough. And just understanding more from reading the book and then reading things online particularly. So the book spurred interest in wanting to learn more about the disability and having to do that also for the assignment I had to do on the book to write a paper on it. And then that is when I found out that autism has a great diversity to the disability, which I hadn't really known that before, that it was so wide-ranging on experiences and challenges and strengths and gifts and talents. And so it was really mind-opening to me. But ironically enough, I actually disagree with a lot of what's presented in that book, Mind Blindness today, that kind of conveys autistic people as lacking empathy. And I don't believe that is true, and I think that a lot of what's been written with mind blindness from a scientific standpoint has some problems.
It's interesting that you say that the book says that a lot of people with autism lack empathy. In a way, the book is saying that what a lot of people with autism lack is this ability to read someone's state of mind.
Yep.
Ability to read facial cues and expressions. What did that particular book do for you in terms of knowing now, having some explanation for your differences?
Well, I think that we do, don't get me wrong, we do have challenges, I think, in reading people's expressions and body language, and I grew up having a lot of difficulties in that area, reading body language, and still, as a 30-year-old adult, trying to get better in that area, continuously working sometimes at times on my nonverbal cues, both understanding and how I'm expressing them. But I think in terms of reading others' mental states, I think everybody actually has challenges in that area, including non-autistic and autistic people. And what we find often is that autistic people often relate better to other autistic people, just as non-autistic people relate better to non-autistic people. But there's a lot of variability in that area. But I think that book, in terms of just how it was well written, really just kind of captured my mind, and being able to think about the disability. And I really love to read a lot of material, read books. So when I went online, I became engrossed in learning about the disability, and then it became one of my interests, if you will. A lot of autistic people, we have really intense focuses, so that became one of them alongside, for instance, technology, which is one of the reasons that I've studied technology during my college career.
And sometimes, in fact, it's described as this narrow and deep focus on things.
Yeah, sometimes it's described as a restricted interest or obsession, if you will. And I try to say it's more of people's passion and interests, because everybody has really great interests that they enjoy. And in many cases, those interests, if you can have the right support around them, they become careers. So, for instance, if someone really loves, for instance, maybe learning about other people, maybe connecting to stories in the world, maybe they become a journalist because that's their passion in life. Same way, for instance, someone loves tinkering with their hands and doing things that are mechanical, to become an engineer. And I think that sometimes we don't discuss that in the conversation with individuals on the autism spectrum growing up, that it's really structuring passions and interests around that can really be great for helping for the workplace. And that ultimately is the goal in life, to me, is jobs, jobs, jobs for everybody, including people with disabilities.
In fact, one of the things you say and are extremely passionate about is that too much of the conversation about autism is about causation,
Yep.
and not enough about the talents and also about improving the life situation for those who have autism. Before I talk about, though, I wanted to ask you, what was it like the first time you met someone who also had autism? Do you remember meeting the first person who you felt was more like you than anyone else?
Yeah, actually, I had met people online after I self-diagnosed on internet chats, which is very common. A lot of autistic people, we find sometimes online communication is easier. You don't necessarily have to read body language if you're just communicating through text communication over texting or instant messaging. It's a lot easier sometimes with communication. So during my undergrad studies, I had met people online, but I hadn't met people in person. And the first time that happened, it was really, it was just an amazing experience when I lived in Pittsburgh. When I just first moved to Pittsburgh, I actually, just couple months after I moved there.
You were going to Carnegie Mellon
I was going to Carnegie
University.
Mellon, and I was about to start my master's studies there in human-computer interaction. And I started working at it's called the Computing Workshop in Pittsburgh, that was based at Carnegie Mellon, now based in, I believe, downtown Pittsburgh, that is focused on teaching technical skills and writing skills and other things like that to autistic youth and young adults, to help them with getting centered for careers later on. And that's where I'd met other autistic adults and youth through this summer program, working there for a couple summers. And it was amazing to finally meet people with the disability experience. And since then, I mean, of course, I've met thousands of people in the last several years for doing all the advocacy work I do. But at the time, I mean, just to have that ability to connect with other people who are autistic was just wonderful, especially since growing up I'm sure that maybe I had known some people who were autistic, we just didn't all identify. You know, it's kind of like you find with some other communities of human diversity, for instance, the LGBT community, where people knew people who were LGBT growing up, they just didn't necessarily know them as identified as LGBT.
In 2006, you co-founded the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which is known as ASAN. Explain for me why such a network was necessary, and what pushback or opposition you've had from professional groups and parent groups that represent those who have autism.
Yeah, my colleagues and I founded ASAN, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, in 2006, and our website is, by the way, is www.autisticadvocacy.org. We founded the organization in part because while there had been a lot of discussion, a lot of the conversation coming from professionals and parents and families about autism, which is very, very important, self-advocates, people who are autistic ourselves, we're not really a part of the conversation. We're not a part of making the change that we want to see in the world. And so we wanted to transform that situation. So we founded the organization as an organization run by autistic people completely, working in collaboration in all of our initiatives with people from the cross-disability community and people in the autism community who are parents and families and professionals and other members of society who support our beliefs in growing inclusion, quality of life, and self-determination for all autistic people and other people with disabilities.
And as you mentioned, you've aligned yourself with the disability rights movement,
Yes.
The slogan for which is "Nothing about us without us."
Yes. That slogan came about also because people with disabilities historically have not always been a part of the conversation, even though when they became part of the movements for disability rights and led the movements in particularly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and helped establish. Many people don't know historically that a lot of the disability rights laws, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, came about because people with disabilities taking charge. People like Justin Dart, Ed Robertson, and others leading the fight for better support in society. And it came about because we expressed our voice and said we want to have change just as much as, for instance, the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement similarly had wanted change in society, had wanted better support, better acceptance for our human experience. And so the autistic rights movement looks to, as an aspirant, the broader disability rights movement.
Speaking of change, it seems to me that the emphasis is that there's some pushback from self-advocates that the goal should not be curing autism, changing those who are autistic, but rather getting the world to accept autistics. It sounds to me like it would be analogous to trying to make everyone who's homosexual straight.
Yeah, that we definitely see a parallel there, that we are here as autistic people and it's lifelong disability, and we want supports, we want services, we want jobs, we want to be able to live in our own communities, we want to be able to go to school around our peers, both people with disabilities and people with not. We want acceptance to society, and some people sometimes misunderstand this message and they say, well, you don't want supports, you don't want services, you don't want, occupational therapy or speech therapy or whatever, which is not true. But people they really sometimes have trouble putting together both diversity and supports for people with disabilities. And we see both as being an equal part of the conversation, being really important for helping empower us and provide accommodation supports at the same time. And these are not mutually exclusive things.
Tell us a little bit about your own experience. You went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute for your undergraduate work, to Carnegie Mellon University for your master's work, and are now all but dissertation working on your PhD here at Penn State. What kinds of accommodations were necessary, and what kinds did you get or would you have liked to have gotten to help you through your own schooling?
Well, when I was growing up, I had service and supports that were more extensive in K-12 because the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDA, the special education law, requires having that extensive array of supports. There's a mandate for that, actually, at the federal level. But when one becomes an adult, going to college or at the workplace, the mandate for colleges is more around the line of accommodations, adaptations, things that help otherwise qualified individuals to adjust and fit in, but aren't necessarily major services supports, are not required under the law. So I had things like extended time on tests, so I could take, say a test that was an hour long, I could take it for an hour and a half, which would help with anxiety, help with some of the processing challenges I have when I'm taking exams. I could take it in a quiet room, and sometimes I got extra notes. But that's about it. I mean, that's about the only kinds of things that are really required, which are only a small part, actually, of the college experience for people, and really don't tap, especially for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities, for instance, people who are autistic, they don't tap the challenges we have, for instance, in fitting in socially, or learning to organize and plan our studies, fitting in with a sensory environment that can be overloading. A lot of these things are not part of accommodations. We're trying to encourage colleges to change this and go above and beyond what the minimum standard has, but that's a little bit hard because colleges often want to set down what the law requires and not necessarily go beyond that. even though for things like athletics, they want to, a lot of universities and colleges will spend a lot more money on that than people with disabilities.
The number of autistic students who are going to college has increased dramatically in the last 15 years, and yet, according to a paper of yours that I read, only a handful of universities specifically address the needs of autistics. Marshall University, Western Kent University, Keene State in New Hampshire, the University of Arizona, the University of Alabama, Oakland University in Michigan. What kinds, and I guess I ask this because Americans understand the need for curb cuts or for handicap parking, but it's much more difficult to figure out what accommodations are needed in a college setting for students who have autism.
Yeah, and that's partly what makes this so hard, and partly why people have to really think about how we can be innovating things is not just in college, but everywhere. The workplace, etc., doing accommodations around neurology is a newer thing. We're not used to doing that. People have gotten fairly good in many cases, though there are still problems in the system. I see lawsuits by the federal government to enforce the ADA often for instance, physical accessibility of buildings. But for neurology adaptations, we're still trying to get there. And because of the fact, as I say, the law doesn't require, that's why a lot of these colleges also haven't done it. Haven't realized of how much meaningful it is for their students. And now it's growing. There are actually more colleges even than in that list that have started doing things. For instance, RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, I was reading about a program the other day where they actually have what are called peer coaches, graduate students that help students, give advice, recommendations, can maybe go to things, extracurriculars with them, not kind of segregate them well, but help them to fit into that inclusive environment of the college experience.
There are also job coaches, people who go out into the work world, job coaching and job carving, so that the part of a job that someone with Asperger's syndrome, for example, who would be very, very good at, carving away the things that they're not good at and giving them to somebody else.
Yeah. Well, and a job coach often helps the individual, maybe prompting, kind of helping them with staying on task, things like that. But often the jobs are the same jobs that anybody else could do. And one of the things that we've emphasized is not necessarily carving out segregated special needs kind of jobs, but helping individuals to work in any positions that people without disabilities would also be working with, just giving them the right support resources. There's some great research actually out recently about how you can be supporting in integrated settings and be having internships, for instance, to help individuals go into jobs with support resources. And this is actually also a part of the new TEAM Acts that were introduced to Congress in February, the Transition Toward Excellence, Achievement, and Mobility Acts that would improve support systems for helping individuals transition from high school into these integrated employment settings, college, and integrated life in the community. And this is particularly for people with intellectual development disabilities, which includes autism. Because partly, not only does it enhance people's quality of life to be included in their community and to be working in jobs that pay a self-sufficient wage, but it is actually more cost-effective than having individuals in segregated, sheltered placements like sheltered workshops.
The reality is that only 6% of autistics are fully employed.
Yep.
What percentage of autistics do you think could be fully employed?
Well, I think a large portion of that is a reflection of how atrocious it is for the broader disability community. Even for the overall disability community, the number of people who are employed is about half that of the community of people without disabilities. So it's atrocious that where we stand right now, and part of that is because of companies have not necessarily taken upon themselves to realize how much it is a human rights issue and imperative, and how much it benefits the community, their communities inside their companies, and the business that they go about doing and their product creation and service delivery to have those diverse experiences. Just as much as hiring more females, having people from broader ethnic diversity, for instance, enhances the workplace.
Not only that, but it's rational thinking that sometimes makes interpersonal communication difficult for someone with autism, but that pure rational thinking can have real benefits in the workplace.
Yeah. I think that autistic people in particular can really benefit the workplace in terms of how we have different views in our thinking processes, because our neurology is so different than non-autistic people, and can be enhancement to the world. But I think it really depends on individual interest in terms of what careers individuals should go into with supports, what they're passionate about, what they have grown up through childhood and then into adolescence and adult life, and maybe shifted, because we all shift over life, right? It's not like we pick a career when we're 9 years old and that's it for the rest of life. We shift around. But whatever fits for individuals and getting better supports in that area so people can pursue their passions and dreams. And I think autistic people particularly often are good at like niche things where they can do them really well, for just whether it's writing or art or technology or journalism or something where they can take a task and a set of things that come along with the job actually and just really practice and do it really specific things really well. And that may, in some cases, for some individuals, minimize challenges where it might be social communication for some individuals, their socialization, their communication skills. Maybe organization planning might be difficult for other individuals, and having jobs that fit around individual weaknesses and difficulties and tapping and honing their strengths.
There seems to be this growing, emerging autism literature, autism art, autism language. For example, new vocabulary words, neurodiversity. Those who don't have autism are referred to as neurotypicals. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
The words that have come into being, like neurodiversity came into being in the late 90s, so did neurotypical, but it takes sometimes many years for things to catch on culturally. We call it part of the autistic disability culture, this terminology, for describing the autistic human experience. Neurotypical actually came about originally because people had jabbed at autistic people saying that we were not human, that our brains were dysfunctional, that we were broken. So it came about originally as a parody, actually, of the brains for non-autistic people saying, oh, they're neurotypical. The reality is nobody is fully neurologically typical, right? And sometimes I even just use non-autistic as the phrase because sometimes people take it really literally. Ironically enough, autistic people sometimes people accuse us of being literal at times, but I know a lot of non-autistic people that see the word neurotypical and think, well, I'm not neurotypical. My brain is just, and it really originally just meant non-autistic, but now sometimes people take it, farther than that. But neurodiversity came about to express the notion of the wide range of thinking experiences, and not just for autism. This includes ADHD, dyslexia, many different ways of being with the world, that there is no standard mold that people fit into with how their brains function.
Well, speaking of being with the world, you a moment ago mentioned high anxiety around a test, and you have experienced periods of depression, high anxiety, low self-esteem throughout your life.
It's been really stressful, I'd say, growing all the way up from, depression, anxiety for me go all the way back to early childhood. You'll find that for a lot of autistic people and other people with disabilities is that we've had mental health challenges from trying to fit in as the round peg into a square hole or vice versa. And trying to fit into places that don't accept us, people's attitudes don't accept us, and their supports don't accept us, and they don't want to provide supports for our challenges has been really, really immensely overwhelming at times. And I had depression originally when I was a child, actually, because I was bullied and victimized a lot.
I was going to ask about that. Your dissertation is on offline and online bullying.
Yes, cyberbullying and face-to-face bullying, and a lot of that. Some of that is I chose that topic partly because of how much it is a challenge for everybody in schools these days. You read a lot about that. I think it's become, I hate to say, maybe even worse since I was a kid. Which is, I grew up in the 80s, and I think now that you have the internet, you have more technologies, more advanced than when I was growing up as a child. I think things have advanced to the point where people are being bullied from all different arenas all the time. But when I was growing up, I also did get bullied myself, and I had fit in academically, but was harassed so much that I actually had to change schools actually in 6th grade to from a public school to a private school for 7th grade called Morristown Baird School in New Jersey. And it really impacted me so much growing up that I even still have nightmares and sometimes still feel the trauma all these years later at 30. I even sometimes have discomfort, even for instance, using restrooms, having been bullied and victimized when I had used the restroom in elementary school, actually. So and there's actually research that backs this up. That has come out in the last few years, that this lingers for individuals. What happens even in childhood stays with individuals their entire lives.
And this has motivated your lifelong pursuit to making life for other autistics better. It's meant for you literally traveling around the world. You've given presentations at the White House, I think 150 presentations in the last couple of years.
Yeah, to me, I found it imperative in my life growing up and having benefited from a lot of supports that have helped me to get through and achieve my undergraduate degree from RPI, my master's degree from Carnegie Mellon, doing my doctoral studies and all the advocacy work. Being able to do that, I think, is a blessing, and so I find it just imperative in my life to pay that forward. I can't pay back the support, but I can pay it forward by helping to transform situations to make life more bearable. I don't think we're ever going to have any perfect world for individuals with disabilities or people experiencing challenges in general, but I think we can make things better. We can make, for instance, bullying, victimization, we can lessen that, so we can make the experience of going to school not as harsh and overbearing for individuals to fit into in our communities.
Scott Robertson, thank you so much for talking with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Scott Robertson. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find a list of autism-related resources. I'm Patty Satalia. We hope you'll join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
If you would like to purchase a DVD of this or any episode of Conversations from Penn State, order online at mediasales.psu.edu or call 1-800-770-2111.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.